Shopify is a platform built for growth, whether you're just starting out or already running a thriving business. From managing inventory to creating a seamless checkout experience, Shopify is designed to handle it all. And it doesn't stop there. Shopify helps you sell everywhere your customers are, online or in person. It's the ultimate tool for turning big dreams into big wins. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/OPP.
Mochi Health is here to help you start your weight loss journey with caring, personalized support. Meet one-on-one with board-certified obesity doctors and registered dietitians who truly listen and understand your unique needs. Eligible patients can access affordable GLP-1 medications delivered right to their door each month. No insurance? No problem. Mochi Health accepts FSA and HSA, making care accessible and affordable. And with 24/7 customer service, you'll never feel alone on your path to better health. Get started with Mochi Health today. Take the free quiz at joinmochi.com and use code AUDIO40 at checkout for $40 off your first month of membership. That's joinmochi.com with promo code AUDIO40.
I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors. Today on the Prosecutors, we conclude our investigation into the death of Kathleen Peterson, and we let you know just who we think is responsible. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined today, as always, with the very best co-host in all of podcasting, Alice.
Hey, Brett. You have no choice. I'm your only co-host.
Well, you're my only co-host, but I'm going further than that. I'm saying that of all the co-hosts, you're the best co-host.
Let's not offend everyone out there.
Oh, it's okay. It's okay. I'm sure, wherever the captain is listening to this podcast, he's saying, that's right, right on, or whatever the captain would say. I like the cut of your jib, or whatever. Anyways, so.
I think our listeners are like, come on, I want to know who did it.
Who did it? Yes. Well, look, Alice has been working like crazy, so you gotta cut us a break if we're a little loopy at this point. If she's loopy,
I'm a lot
I don't
loopy.
know what my excuse is.
You've been busy too. I don't know. I think people thought this week they would just really not follow the law in my jurisdiction, and I'm just a little bit tired. That's all.
Yeah, that was a good thing about quarantine is most people just stayed in their house and didn't break the law, and so it kind of slowed down a little bit. But I feel like people are making up for lost time.
They're like, you know what? I've been bored, and now I'm going to go break me some laws.
Exactly. But before we bore you to death, today we're going to finish our investigation of the staircase. Yay!
Yay!
Yay! Boo if you really love this case.
No, this has been so much to cover. I know we've had a 4-parter just one other time on Maura Murray. And it's funny because Maura Murray doesn't really have that much evidence, but this has just so much, and we've really had to jam-pack it in 4 episodes.
Yeah, I never want to hear anybody complain again that we don't put enough law in our episodes, because this has basically been, we've said it. You could pass the bar at this point in your state if you've just listened to these 4 episodes, and we're going to keep going today. We're going to teach you even more law stuff. It's Law Nerd City. You guys are so excited. It's so crazy because Alice and I are like, man, the people are going to be bored with that. And then they say, oh man, we want to hear more about FOIA. That has never been said before in the history of mankind.
Never, ever been said. And that has been our most positive response, is the specific subject of FOIA, which boggles my mind.
No, it makes no sense. It's crazy. You people are crazy.
We love you guys, but you have really weird taste.
Yeah, apparently we found the few people in the world who want to listen to us talk about, weird, not even weird, like boring legal stuff. But we got some exciting stuff for you today, too, that's not legal, as we wrap up this investigation and we can move on to a new case. We're getting pretty close to having covered everything. As Alice said, there's so much in this case. It takes a while if you want to cover it well, and we did want to do that. We did not want to have, one episode on the staircase. I don't think you can do that. We wanted to hit everything, and this is just such a rich case to study. And we got a few more things we're going to talk about today. And let's start. We've talked about this some up to this point, but we haven't talked about this particular aspect of it, and that's the blood. Keep coming back to the blood because people come back to the blood all the time. The blood in this case, at least some people believe, tells the story. It tells the story of Michael Peterson killing Kathleen Peterson, or it tells the story of an accident, of her falling down the stairs and him finding her dead. So there was a lot of blood. That's something that everybody knows. You can't deny it. If you've seen the photos, it's a bloodbath. Now we know, everybody knows, head injuries bleed a lot. When Alice tried to kill her brother that time.
Come on.
His head wound bled a lot.
Here's one thing I wanted to follow up on that story. If you've seen the pictures of the lacerations on Kathleen's head, you know that they were really large gashes. The amount of blood coming out of my brother's head, he did end up getting stitches, but it was something like 2 or 3 stitches, just to give you an idea of how small that particular gash was for my brother and how much blood I saw. I do think the gashes she had on her head would cause all this blood. Now, what causes the gashes? That's the question.
So my blood story, as I said, I don't have a story of, a big gash on anybody's head, but one time my dog, I have a hound dog, and he escaped from his enclosure once. And the way he did it was a fence, but then there was part of the fence that was wooden and was, nailed in like a wooden fence. And I guess he just spent the day that day like slamming his body against the wood, and eventually he knocked the fence down. And when he knocked the fence down, there were some nails like hanging out. And I guess when he got out of the fence, he sort of like caught his ear, his big floppy ear, on one of these nails, and he had this like wound on his ear. So the neighbor called him and kept him in her backyard and gave me a call, and I came home from work and I got the dog, and she's like, "Look, his ear's hurt, it's bleeding, watch out, it can be pretty messy." And I'm thinking, okay, whatever. But it was a nasty day. It was like pouring down rain, and he was all muddy, and he had blood all over him from his ear wound. And so I decided I'm going to take him inside and I'm going to give him a bath. And when I took him into the bathroom, he did, the dog shake the dogs do, where they shake their whole body and they shake their head. And when he shook his head, that ear went up and down, and blood just went everywhere. There was more cast off in my bathroom than there was in the staircase. It was, I tried to clean it up, and I swear we would find blood for months afterwards, like dried blood. And I remember telling my wife, I now understand how hard it is to kill somebody and get away with it, because the blood just goes everywhere. And this was this tiny little wound on his ear. And at one point, Dr. Lee even talks about this, that if Kathleen Peterson is shaking her head or whatever, how the blood would go everywhere. But one thing that's interesting about this case, there are a couple things. So the people who think that Michael Peterson did it, there are a few pieces of evidence they always point to. One of them is the blood in his shorts, right? They say, how could he get the blood in his shorts if he didn't beat her? And the idea, I guess, is that he's like standing. I'm not even sure how he would do it. And you saw Dwayne Deaver go to great lengths to recreate this blood spatter. But I'm not even sure how you would do it if you were actually trying to kill somebody. He's doing it for the express purpose of creating the blood spatter in that place, the shorts. But in any event, the theory is he's standing over Kathleen. He's beating her. I don't know how that blood spatter got in
But if you
shorts.
think about it, you almost have to like beat between your legs.
I know. It's really
weird.
weird.
Like it's a weird position. I don't know how blood got inside the shorts, but to be standing in front of them where you like reach between your legs and like get enough force to beat someone between your legs seems a little strange. Enough that blood splashes up into your pants, right?
And it seems to me the more likely thing is you can imagine, you see the love of your life. Like imagine it's an accident. You walk in, you see the love of your life lying at the bottom of the stairs in a pool of blood, and you run up to her, and maybe as you get close to her, you're like going down, like you're dropping to your knees or whatever. And when you do that, there's like a splash of blood.
A splash of blood, or like one of her like arms or legs like scoots into your like, because you're like sliding into it,
Right. I can think of all sorts of ways it happens. Now, look, I don't know how it happened, and maybe it did happen when he was beating her to death, but it seem to me at least, as if it is a blood spatter that could only be created in that manner. And I feel like, once again, the problem with Dwayne Deaver is Dwayne Deaver was just trying to show it's possible that this blood got there through a beating. He wasn't actually trying to demonstrate real world how the blood would be distributed. And as Alice said, I mean, his demonstration where he finally creates the blood, that didn't do anything for me because I'm like, well, that's not how he beat her, so I don't know why this is relevant, right? Like, you were able to do it doing what you did, but there's no way that's what he was doing. And so I never really understood that.
And what was one of the most compelling things for me about the no cast off is I think it's Rudolph. He shows it. He's raising the blowpoke or whatever thing is supposed to be the murder weapon. And he's like, what? You're supposed to just lift it about 12 inches off, and then you keep hitting repeatedly in a 12-inch diameter. That makes no sense because usually you probably raise it over your head, and that's where the cast off happens, right? Blood that's on the murder weapon flies up as you raise it to then hit it again. It was comical the way he was doing it, and I thought it was effective because the jurors could see how unnatural it would be. You can't hurt anything if you're raising it 12 inches hitting, 12 inches hitting. You don't even hit a drum that way. Right? I'm watching my toddler hit his little, a xylophone with his mallet. And he raises it higher than that. And if there were water or blood on that, it would splatter everywhere going up in like a semicircle and all the way back down. Especially if it's in fast succession. And
this just goes back, and I don't want to spend all day harping on Dwayne Deaver, but it goes back to how pathetic his recreations are because, once again, Dwayne Deaver did that with the idea of, I have to do this in such a way that doesn't create a lot of cast off because there wasn't a lot of cast off. The person killing Kathleen wasn't thinking about cast off. He wasn't thinking, how do I not create cast off? Right? That just wasn't happening. So the fact that there's no cast off, that there's only a few drops of blood, higher up on the wall, to me is a huge problem. And I also thought Rudolph did a good job with that. There's the footprint on the back of Kathleen's or the side of Kathleen's pants. I never really thought that was that significant either because, once again, I don't think that Michael Peterson, if he comes in and he finds his wife like that, is tiptoeing around. He easily could have stepped on the back of her pants as he's trying to save her or whatnot. It's not, to me, not that convincing. And once again, if you imagine that he's got her sort of on her stomach and he's standing on the back of her leg to hold her there. That's even more just how violent an attack this was. And how do you have that violent an attack with no cast off and no fractures? How do you do that? Mm-hmm. And the prosecution said it's a blowpoke, but it wasn't the blowpoke. We know that now. Leave the blowpoke behind.
I don't think we've talked about this, and they don't spend much time talking about it in the evidence, but typically if it's a beating, you don't usually knock someone out in the first blow, right? That's why there's so many blows. And so usually there's some sort of struggle, and you usually find DNA under someone's fingernails to show a struggle. And if there was Michael's DNA under her nails, that would have been in evidence. But my understanding is there's no mention of it, which probably means there is none.
And we know, for instance, that she had blood on the bottom of her feet. So that means this wasn't he, snuck up on her, hit her from behind, and she never knew what was coming and never recovered. At some point, she was standing up in the blood. And I think that goes to what Alice is saying. She wouldn't have just gone down without a fight. And she does have some wounds on her hands and on her face that would indicate some sort of defensive action was taken, but not the kind you would expect. Like Alice said, there are no scratches on Michael. There's no DNA under her fingernails. It's just you're not seeing some of the things you would see if this were a murder.
The only thing in her hands, correct me if I'm wrong here, are strands of her own hair.
Right.
So not someone else's hair, not someone else's clothing, DNA. It's really hard to be attacking someone up close and not have your DNA on them.
And the other place there's no blood is on Michael's shirt. How did he do that? And in the documentary, if you watch it, Nancy Grace is doing the show, and they just make up out of whole cloth, well, maybe he changed his shirts, right? And we see this so much in every case we do, where, I've stayed invested in the Maura Murray community, and I see folks do this in the Maura Murray community all the time, where they just sort of make up things, right? They're just like, well, maybe it wasn't Maura in the car at the crash, and
It's
you're
like there's no
well,
evidence of that.
yeah, and then they say, well, there's no evidence of anything. You don't know what happened until we know
anything
what happened,
is
right?
possible.
And it's like, no, that you can't do that. You don't just get to invent scenarios and then have nothing to back it up but the creativity of your
And
mind.
point to the lack of evidence.
Right. And I guess this bloody shirt is wherever the murder weapon is, right? Like, he wrapped the murder weapon, the other hollow instrument he used to cause this injury. He wrapped that in his bloody shirt and then, gave it to Todd and his girlfriend when they got back from the party and they got rid of it or something. But there's just no evidence of it. There's no evidence that Michael Peterson disposed of a shirt. And if he did dispose of a shirt, why didn't he dispose of his shorts, right? Like, why? This is such a weird thing for him to do, to just get rid of the shirt. I think the more likely thing is there's no blood on the shirt.
Kind of like the emails, right? Delete
Right.
like the financial struggles emails, but not the porn emails and the cheating emails. That makes no sense. Change your shirt, but not your shorts.
And that's the craziest thing about this case is there's always just enough evidence. You asked me last time, would you prosecute this case? I don't know how you don't. I don't know how you don't start off prosecuting it because there is evidence, and we don't mean to poo-poo the evidence. There is evidence. The blood in the shorts is evidence. The deleting of the emails is evidence.
Him being the only one there, the amount of blood, like that there definitely is. I don't think that this was completely frivolous.
But with every piece of evidence you have, there's blood in the shorts, but there's no blood on the shirt, right? He deleted the emails, but not the really incriminating ones. Like, it's just there's a tit for every tat in this case, and I think that's the thing that makes it so fascinating to me, at least. There are other cases that I'm not going to mention their names because we may look at them later, and I hate to give away what we think. But there are other cases with very famous documentaries about them where it is very obvious the person is guilty, and I just feel like that is not the case here. There is a lot of weirdness and almost inexplicable things in this case. Now, one thing people say is, well, he didn't splash. If he found her after an accident, he didn't splash in any blood and get that in his shorts because the blood was dry. And this is a huge thing people point to all the time. One of the major pieces of evidence because it seems to show that Kathleen Peterson had been dead for quite a while when she was found. But here's the problem I have with that, and I feel like it's something that people don't focus on enough. That fact that the blood was dry was not in the police officer's reports. To me, that is stunning. It is stunning. If it's true, it's absolutely stunning.
We have faced this a lot, haven't we? Where there's a critical fact that would make, say, a search of a vehicle constitutional, but that key fact isn't in a report. What do you do, Brett, when you see a report lacking that key fact that would make some sort of search constitutional?
A lot of times you dismiss the case or you never bring it.
Exactly. You're like, well, heck no. If it's not in the report.
Yeah, I mean, if a police officer came to you, person out there who's not even an attorney, and they give you a report and they tell you, well, the reason we searched the car is because we smelled marijuana. And then you look at the report and it's like, we pulled them over for speeding and then we searched the car. And they didn't include that in there. I mean, what would you think? Would you think, I wonder if they're just making that up to justify the thing they did Because wouldn't they put that in their report? Now, maybe they're not. It could have been an honest mistake. But every police officer knows this. They know that if you don't put it in the report and then you try and claim it later, you are going to be pummeled by defense attorneys.
And here's the thing. It's the closest in time report, right? Your testimony, even if you think you remember it, is going to be probably months, maybe years later. Your report is supposed to be written really probably that day. And so if that key fact isn't there, man, you're in a world of hurt, even if you just left it out by accident. So the fact that it's not in the report is, like Brett said, enough to often dismiss a case.
And we've talked about how every homicide detective sees a homicide everywhere, but it's also true that at this stage in the investigation, it really is the most neutral stage for the police officers. They don't know if there's a crime. They don't know if they need to continue the investigation. So the things they're seeing and the things they're reporting, you feel like they're probably not biased at that point, right? So they're probably, whatever they put in the report is what actually happened. If a homicide detective came in and saw all this blood and it was dry, he would know immediately what that means. He would know. And the fact that it's not in there just makes you wonder if later on somebody said, man, it sure would be nice if all that blood had been dry, you know? And it is hard for me to get past that. And I see people bring up this point about the dry blood so often, and I get it. There are multiple people who say the blood was dry, but the fact it's not in any of the reports bothers me a lot.
Yep. And because when you write the report, because it's close in time, there hasn't been media coverage, you haven't talked to other people, but if you are now at trial and you are on the stand, you've heard kind of how the prosecution has shaped you. Even if you don't think you're making up a fact, you are persuaded. We are all very persuadable beings, right? We like to think we're all independent thinkers, but we're really not. It's really easy to make someone think they think something. So even if these people are testifying what they think is truthfully, they may have just been shaded in what they now see the case as.
I think it's a problem, and I know it's something that Rudolph focused on a lot in his cross-examination, but it's also one of those things that I think the layperson just doesn't really know. I mean, I could totally imagine the jury being like, oh, whatever, he forgot to put that in his report. What's the big deal, right? But for us, in the position we're in and seeing all these reports, it really is a red flag for me. It doesn't mean the blood wasn't dry. It may very well have been dry. But that's so significant. It would be nice just to know, or at least to feel more confident about that fact.
Right. So we've spent a lot of time on the blood. Here's another thing that is very interesting. So talking about prosecutor angles, there are the coroners. So Dr. Kenneth Snell, he's the chief medical examiner for Chapel Hill. He actually showed up at the scene of Kathleen's death. And there, when he looked at everything, the blood and her, he determined that the cause of death was a closed head injury, blunt force injury to the head that was due to a fall down the stairs. You know, he believed that Kathleen hit her head on two different parts of the stairs before ending up at the very bottom. And that's what causes the multiple lacerations, because she had more than one fall. Deborah Radish also works for the state, but she's the pathologist. She disagrees with Dr. Snell, and she does testify at the trial. She says instead that the cause of Kathleen's death is severe concussive injury of the brain caused by multiple blunt force injuries to the head. And the bleeding was at most just a contributing cause of death. But what caused her death was this severe brain injury. I don't understand how Deborah Radish gets there. Because, as we've already noted many times before, there are no skull fractures, and Kathleen's brain was not swollen. So, how could a beating have been severe enough to kill her, but not have caused either kinds of those injuries that we see in typical brain injuries? So, I feel like Deborah Radish's conclusion is a contradiction in itself.
We're going to talk about the fact, we're going to talk about it in a minute, and we've been talking about how we're going to talk about this for the last 3 episodes, but we're finally getting to it, the Elizabeth Ratliff case. She seems more confident in what killed Elizabeth Ratliff, who died 16 years before, than she does in what killed Kathleen Peterson. And I don't understand how to this day we still are arguing about the cause of death in this case.
Yeah. And you remember, I think it was Deborah Radish who didn't even find like parts of the evidence that were stuffed into the body bag, right? I mean, this just doesn't seem like a very thorough exam.
Right. And if I remember correctly, at some point Rudolph talks about the fact, and I think he cross-examined her on this, that there was a note, or maybe this actually came up. There's so much that came up after he was convicted because the prosecution didn't actually turn over all the evidence, that note between her and her boss where she originally doesn't find that blunt force trauma had anything to do with it, and she sort of gets overruled. I mean, there's so much going on there that bothers me.
Yeah. But then, but she testifies, and she never mentions that other opinion she had previously. And this is what we're talking about. While it may be an inconvenient fact for the prosecution, you're still supposed to tell the truth on the stand. Doesn't matter who you work for. If you changed your mind at some point because someone convinced you otherwise, let's be generous. She wasn't overruled. Her boss pointed some things out to her, and she changed her mind. She should really testify about how she changed her mind and not leave out that very important fact.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and we talked about this. At the end of the day, your job as a prosecutor is to present the evidence and to do it in a way that tells a story that a jury of lay people can understand so they can decide whether or not this person is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. I mean, that's your job. And it's really easy to get lost, and we all do it, and everybody does it, gets lost in the, I want to win, right? But that's what you're supposed to be doing. And playing, I think this is probably a kind of way to think of it, playing these kind of games as the prosecution, it's just not appropriate. And there's a reason at the end of the day, Michael Peterson's conviction didn't stick. And you can think that a guilty man went free, but if he went free, it was because at the end of the day, the prosecution didn't do their job.
Okay, should we move on to a very anticipated part of this show?
I think we should.
I think it's time. I think we have teased this particular part of the show for so many episodes now. We should just get to it. All right. You guys asked for it. We're finally going to give you a discussion about Rule of Evidence 404B.
Woo! 404B!
So
Yay!
we're laughing because so many of you guys wrote about this and we could not believe it. Okay, so 404B really is actually a fascinating area of law. So I'm just going to read you what the rule is because there's just so much to parse here. Basically, this rule is about bringing in prior bad acts in order to, into your current case, right? So generally, evidence of a crime, wrong, or other act is not admissible to prove a person's character in order to show that on a particular occasion, the person acted in accordance with the character. So in other words, typically you can't show that Ratliff died at the bottom of a staircase in order to show that Michael killed Kathleen at the bottom of a staircase. That's classic 404B, right? You can't say that this person robbed banks all the time in the past. He's robbed banks many times before. He's even convicted of it. You can't say because of that he committed this bank robbery here that's before this jury.
And just to take a moment, because I know a lot of you are hearing that and thinking,
why not?
Why not?
Why not?
The guy's a bank robber. That seems relevant.
This is like in every documentary, right? Documentaries love 404B evidence. They're like, of course, it shows that they did other bad acts because it's a complete character for them to do this. Documentaries do this all the time. You can't do this in court.
All the time. But remember, we are talking about this moment in time, this crime, evidence about this crime. Did this person do this thing? And the fact that they did this other thing 5 years before does not in any way show that they did this, right? And I know that can be difficult to wrap your head around, and sometimes I even have trouble with it. And let me give you an example. I had a case overturned once on 404B. It was a murder trial, and the guy that was tried, he was accused of killing this person and then burning their body, right? And there was evidence that he had done it. There was some forensic evidence, but it wasn't super strong. But the strongest evidence that we had was he had become obsessed with fire in the weeks leading up to this death. And he had decided that the world was impure, and the only way to purify the world was through fire. And he burned like all of his stuff. And his girlfriend, he made her sit in front of the fire that he would build and pray. And he would say, like, you've got to pray, you've got to purify yourself, because if you can't purify yourself through praying, I'm going to have to burn you too. Right? So we introduced all this stuff, and the guy was convicted, and it goes up on an appeal. And I just thought, this is going to stick. I mean, this stuff is absolutely relevant to the crime, but that's not how the Supreme Court saw it. They said that this was improper under 404B, that it was more prejudicial than it was probative of what this guy was doing, and that that his involvement with fire in that way was not sufficiently related to the murder to be able to be introduced. And so his conviction was overturned, and he had to be tried again. So it's a fine line you have to walk. But it's really important. It's one of the most important rules of evidence that we have.
It really is. And as great it is to be able to tell a story with 404B evidence in, say, a documentary or in a movie, it really does make sense for due process why it's not allowed, right? It's just supposed to be this is why you're not allowed to talk to the jury outside of the courtroom, right? This is why you're not supposed to have ex parte communications with the judge, because we're all supposed to be dealing with the same closed universe. And it may be a fiction, but it's a closed universe, and that's the best control we can have. And it's how we've decided as a society we can best reach a just outcome.
And think about it this way, and I don't want to dive into some of the controversial stuff that's going on right now, but whenever you have sort of a police shooting or a death in custody, a lot of times something that people come out with is they'll say something like, well, 10 years ago, he was convicted of X, right? And just think about for a second, is the fact that he was convicted of that 10 years ago, is that relevant to that night in that encounter and whether or not the use of force was justified? And I'll let you answer that question for yourself, but it's the same kind of thing. How relevant is what happened in the past to the situation you have at hand now?
For every rule, just like in our first episode, we told you our rules, there are exceptions. So there is an exception to 404B, and they're actually pretty big exceptions. So the type of evidence we just talked about, the other types of, evidence of crimes, wrongs, or other acts, they might be admissible for another purpose. So not to show that they committed the crime at hand, but to prove, say, motive, opportunity, intent, preparation, a plan, knowledge, identity, absence of mistake, or lack of accident. So I just listed a lot of things. So don't despair if you thought, wow, this rule is so unfair, because there's actually a really long list of things. And here's the thing. You're usually trying to get evidence through 404B exceptions, and you say it's for showing that there's lack of mistake or it's for motive. But really also you're hoping the jury thinks, and that's why they did it here. I'm just telling you the truth, right?
No, absolutely.
You're like, oh yeah, this totally shows how he did not mistakenly carry a gun with him that day. But that's why he had a gun that day and committed this crime. And it goes both ways. It's not just prosecutors using it. It's defense using it too. So it works both ways. And that's why there's motions you have to make to be able to qualify for these exceptions. So you don't just get to say for yourself, oh, this is an exception, it qualifies, and you get it in. You actually have to argue to the judge, and the judge has to decide whether one of the exceptions applies. And then also, when he's making that determination, he has to think about weighing how probative that evidence is with how prejudicial it is.
And that's like the heart of evidence, right? I mean, the the most important rule of evidence, and really all the rules of evidence are based on this. They're really just another version of this, is how probative is it of a person's guilt? And that just means how relevant and significant and important is it to showing that this person committed this crime versus how unduly prejudicial it is. Now, every piece of evidence is prejudicial, because if the gun that was smoking with the bullet that matches the bullets that were in the victim were found in the defendant's hand, that's very prejudicial against him. It is really going to hurt him. But that's the kind of prejudice you want in a trial. What you don't want is unfair prejudice. So when you have these 404B questions, they are going to be, so for instance, let's say, going back to Alice's bank robbery point, how you robbed a bunch of banks before, but that doesn't mean you robbed the bank this time. Well, what if every time you robbed a bank, you dressed up like a clown, and you robbed a bunch of banks, and then you went away for 10 years, and the clown robberies stopped, and then you got out of jail, and then a bank gets robbed, and it's another clown, and it's a clown with the exact same kind of face paint as the prior clown robberies. Now, that would be an exception to 404B, because it shows a connection and a pattern that goes beyond just the simple fact that you robbed a bank before. Because it's not just that you robbed a bank. You robbed it in this very specific, unique way that was sort of your signature. So you can bring that in, even though the fact that, you were convicted of robbing 10 banks is still prejudicial, and it's still going to affect the way the jury looks at you, because you're doing it for this added purpose, which is very relevant to the current crime and very probative of whether or not you committed it. You can go ahead and bring that in anyway.
These are arguments. These are lawyer arguments that you make outside of the presence of the jury. And it's up to the judge. And sometimes it can be really frustrating if you think your case hinges on being able to let in some 404B evidence and the court decides it is too prejudicial and they keep it out. I'm trying to think of a good example. I can't think of one for bank robbery, but I will say, if oftentimes I have found that judges find much too prejudicial some sort of sexual misconduct or sexual assault or rape, if the charge or the count that they're being charged with is not having anything to do with domestic assault or sexual assault. Just because, as you can imagine, people have visceral reactions to something like this person committed a rape before. So you can see how maybe that's more prejudicial than probative from a judge's perspective. Or actually, we have something in this case we can talk about, whether it's more prejudicial than probative.
Yes, we can. And that's, before we get to the most famous example of this, let's talk about the evidence that Michael was gay. And I put that way for a very specific reason, because I think there are different shades of this. And I think people treat it like a black and white issue. And when they watch the documentary, they feel very strongly that the prosecution's introduction of evidence about Michael's sexuality was improper and should have been excluded. And I agree with them as far as that goes. But let me ask you this. If it were evidence that Michael had had an affair with a woman, would that be admissible? I think everybody would say, yes, obviously, because it goes to motive. Is it prejudicial to him? Sure, it's going to make the jury not like him as much because they're going to think of him as a cheater. But the fact that he was having an affair goes to his motive and explains why he might have killed his wife. The problem is the prosecution didn't bring it in that way, right? They didn't treat it like Michael was having an affair. That wasn't enough for them. They went further than that. It became really...
They were gay shaming him.
Yeah, it's icky to be gay, right? I mean, that is what the lady prosecutor is doing every time she talks about this. She's trying to get these sort of like traditional folks from Durham.
Southern jury, right?
Yeah. To feel like, oh, well, ooh, I don't like that, right? And decide he's guilty of murder because he's gay. And it's very clear that she's doing that. And that, I think, is absolutely improper.
Yeah, I agree with you. The prosecution, if they were more savvy, they should have just focused on the cheating part and say, okay, judge, we just want to show that he cheated. But how are we going to separate that from the fact that it was men? How do we can't use a neutral term, like every time we talk about it, we'll be like, well, Michael was texting with he, she, and like make it almost impossible for the judge to say, well, I guess you can't really keep out the fact that it was men he was talking to. But instead, they just went full bore on gross. He's bisexual. That must mean he is perverse in some way, so perverse that he would even murder his own wife.
And, there's this balance in a trial, because a trial is not a scientific endeavor, right? It's not just about literally, here's a scale and this is how much, reasonable doubt weighs, and the evidence, each piece of evidence weighs a certain amount. And once we put enough pieces of evidence on the scale, it tips, right? Like you see this in everything. For instance, defense attorneys will often try and object to pictures of the scene. And they'll say, look, the jury doesn't need to see all this. They don't need to see all this blood. They don't need to see how viciously and violently the person was murdered. All they need to know is they're dead. That's all they need to know. And the only reason the prosecution wants to introduce this is they want to inflame the jury. They want the jury to be righteously indignant and feel like this poor person who was brutally murdered needs justice. And that's exactly what we want. And the courts have said over and over and over again, that's fine. You can introduce that, because there is a balance here where this is more. It is more than just science. There is, and you may feel uncomfortable about this, but there's a feeling to it as well. When you're asking 12 people to convict another person and send them to jail, and where that line is hard to say. And Alice is absolutely right. They could have accomplished the same improper thing they accomplished properly. And that may also make you feel uncomfortable. But if they had done it correctly, and they had just the facts, man, he reached out to an escort. That escort's name was Brad. We'll put Brad on the stand to confirm that happened. He was obviously unfaithful, and they just left it at that. Everybody in North Carolina would have known he was having a gay affair, right? They would have known that.
And you know what, though? If the prosecution had done that, I bet they would have scored more points with the jury, because the jury's probably thinking, whoa, they didn't pull out the fact that this is a guy. Anyone else see this? And it would almost draw more attention to that fact. And then the prosecution would look like they're wearing the white hat.
Right. No, that's a good point. It really depends on your jury to a certain extent, and what you think the jury's going to think and how you think they're going to take it. And you talked about this with the blowpoke, when the defense found the blowpoke, and how delicate that is, because you can't just run in like waving the the blowpoke and being like, ha, we found it, yay!
You gotta be humble. Humble.
And Rudolph even says that when they're walking in. He's like...
Doesn't he say, like, don't get overconfident?
Yeah, don't get cocky or don't get overconfident or something like that. And he's 100% right.
And here's the thing. We don't know where the line is for the jury to convince them on whether to vote guilty or to acquit. And it's different for every juror. And here's another thing. One particular fact could tip the whole balance for a juror. So maybe all of the blood, all of the evidence, they're like, yeah, that completely convinces me one way. But one thing, maybe the gay porn, maybe that makes one juror say, despite all the evidence, I would vote the other way because of this one thing. That's what gets me. And we've all said this, and we see this on the online community, right? People get fixated on one fact, and that's all they can think about. And there's almost nothing you can say that will convince them otherwise, because they are just fixated on that one fact.
No, I think that's 100% right.
Okay, so let's talk about then. I think we both kind of agree that ultimately you probably could get in the fact that he was bisexual. But did Kathleen actually know? Because so the prosecution says Kathleen had no idea that's why this happened. She found out on the computer that night about the affairs, and that's when she said she was going to leave him, and then he beat her to death. The defense says, no, she knew all along. She knew he was attracted to men. He still loved her, but this was just a part of his personality, and she knew about the get-togethers with other men, and she was okay with it. So what do you think, Brett? Did Kathleen know that, first, that he was attracted to men, and second, if she knew that he was having sex with other men?
We talked about this a little bit before. I think No, I mean, I don't think she knew. I think she was aware. I think she was aware that he had these bisexual tendencies. I don't think she knew that he was calling Brad up, for meetups at the hotel. I'll never believe that. And I don't think Michael Peterson really believes that. He never says it. It's more like a sort of spiritual, of course she knew because we were that connected. He even says at one point, I wish we could have talked about it more explicitly. So I don't think she knew. And I will tell you, just going back to the proper evidence versus the improper evidence, the fact that I don't think she knew, to me, is the strongest reason to think maybe Michael Peterson did kill her, because I've always said that would have been the motive, is she went to use his computer that night to get that email with her work friend, and while in his computer, she stumbled upon some emails or photos that confirmed to her that he was having this affair. And I dare say every single person listening to this has either had personal experience or has a friend who has done exactly that, who has stumbled upon something on the computer that confirmed for them something, or maybe not even confirmed for them, revealed to them something they had no idea was going on. And I think that's the best story for Michael Peterson murdering his wife.
But here's the weird part, right? It would seem to be I almost can't see him get that mad, because his brothers know that he's attracted to men. He seems to talk very unapologetically about it. He doesn't even try to pretend like that's not the case. It's not like she found out a secret of his that no one knows. Maybe the cheating part. I get that, the cheating part, maybe, but I don't know. I don't quite see him, just based on the way he talks and what's known about him, to fly off the handle like that.
No, and, this goes back to something else. Everybody said they had a great marriage. They all did. Caitlin did. Candace Samparini did. Now, they all said eventually, well, we didn't know what was going on behind closed doors. And that's absolutely true. And you have men who abuse their wives all the time and people don't know about it. But it seems like the examples of Michael losing his temper are few and far between. They exist, and you hear about those if you look into this. But they're literally just a couple incidents over a very long period of time. And just remember, his first wife, his ex-wife, who he divorced and then married, Kathleen, she sticks with him the entire time. A woman that he was married to for years.
Oh yeah, she's sitting behind him for every single one of his hearings for a decade.
Even the last one, she's there when he takes the Alfred plea. I mean, this is a remarkable thing. His two daughters with Elizabeth, or not with, well, it depends on where you read on the internet. Elizabeth Ratliff's two daughters stick with him to this very day. And they lived in that household. Caitlin lived in that household. If they had thought he was a violent man, that would have come up. But for them, it's more, or for Caitlin and for Candace, it's more, well, he was hiding it, and we didn't see the true monster, and it came out that night. Maybe. Right. Not saying that doesn't happen.
But they're not saying it's because I've seen him act like this.
Right.
It's rather, I've never seen him act like this. That means that he hid it from me.
Right. Exactly.
Kind of goes to what we were complaining about. That's what we complained about earlier, about people making up facts and saying, well, there's lack of evidence to disprove it, so therefore it is.
Right. Yeah. And you just see that so often when people are trying to confirm the conclusions they've already reached. And everybody does that. And I think you see that from both sides of the family. Caitlin and Candace feel that way, or they are doing that very thing. And you see that, it's interesting with the Elizabeth Ratliff stuff, and we can just go ahead, I guess, and start talking about that. That first comes up because Elizabeth's sister, who lives somewhere in the Northeast, possibly Maine, possibly Connecticut, I don't remember exactly. She's the first one who brings it to the police's attention. And the reason she does is because she doesn't like Michael. Because Liz Ratliff, in her will, specified that the two girls, if something were to happen to her, would be raised by Michael. And her sister wanted to raise those girls.
That's a pretty big burn as a sister.
She wanted to raise those girls herself, and Michael's like, her will said she wanted me to do it, so I'm going to do that. So she has a reason not to like Michael, and she has a reason to think that what happened to Liz Ratliff was a murder. Let's just talk about that. We've been bouncing around it for a long time. I know, Alice, when I saw the documentary, when they pulled that out, I was like, well, he's guilty.
Yeah, ditto. I think you told me that before I even saw it. I said, it sounds like an accident. You said, well, you didn't hear about the other woman at the bottom of the stairs. And I was like, what? Oh, guilty. I didn't even need to hear more evidence. And that probably was one of those things where in some jurors' minds, they couldn't get over it, right? We were talking about how no matter how much evidence you pile on one side of the not guilty, that fact alone may have made them say, well, probably guilty, because what are the chances?
Right. What are the chances? Two women, both connected to him. And you even hear it, and you see it as well. So I'm going to post on our website, and it'll be linked to the first episode. I don't know if you guys have noticed this, but I tend to just put all the documents up with the first episode. The decision by the North Carolina Supreme Court upholding Michael's conviction, and they go into detail about why it was not reversible error to include this. Now, the main reason they say, and this is another thing to remember about appeals, we could talk about appeals all day long too. The trial judge gets a lot of discretion. Appeal judges kind of defer to him because he's there, he's on the scene, he's seeing what's going on. And so if he makes a decision, it has to be a really bad decision to get overturned. And so the main reason that they stick with his decision about the Ratliff stuff is because of that. But they also go through the similarities. They tick off why these similarities were sufficient to support Judge Hudson's decision. And it is. These are two women he was very close with. They were both found at the bottom of the stairs. Michael Peterson was the last person to see both of them. And there's a few others. Oh, they both have lacerations on their head, etc., etc. But if you've watched the documentary, you know that by the end of it, Judge Hudson has changed his mind. By the end of it, with a decade or more of experience, and I don't know how much experience he had when he started off, but certainly by the end of it, he's like, that shouldn't have come in.
Because here's the thing, I can't think of anything more prejudicial, no matter how probative.
Prejudicial out the wazoo. There is nothing
even if it were probative, which I don't actually think it is, and we can talk more about that. The prejudicial nature of it is just too much that I don't think you can have a fair trial.
Yeah, and they're trying to make... So imagine this scenario. Elizabeth Ratliff is found shot to death with a one-of-a-kind, 33 caliber weapon. It's a golden bullet that nobody's ever seen before. And 16 years later, Kathleen Peterson is also killed by a 33 golden bullet. Okay, fine. That's very similar, right? Like, you can totally understand why those two things are related.
But here's the thing. Ratliff's autopsy said that it was an accident by brain aneurysm. Like, I think it was the brain aneurysm first, and then that caused her to fall.
Right.
And the fall didn't kill her. It was the brain aneurysm. What they did was to exhume her body in order to get a different result. So, I mean, I don't think I ever get to the point where you exhume the body as the judge, right? I mean, I know because the family gave consent, whatnot, but they're changing essentially the fact. They're saying it wasn't a golden bullet, but what if we painted it gold? Then it would look the same, right?
That's exactly right. Alice, that's perfect. I mean, you are 100% right, and that is the problem with all of this. And the problem that I can't understand how Hudson didn't see this. It's not that you have this woman murdered at the bottom of a staircase and they never figured out who did it. It wasn't a murder. 16 years ago, it wasn't called a murder. There wasn't a bunch of evidence that it was a murder. They had to try, and if you watch the documentary, you see them do this. They had to try Elizabeth Ratliff's murder case in Kathleen Peterson's murder case to prove that she was murdered so they could then use it as evidence against Kathleen. Or against him killing Kathleen.
Now that is just crazy town. That is crazy town.
It's insane. It's insane. I mean, and how do you do that?
Because they're having to litigate it 16 years later and they're not actually litigating that, right? They're just putting on their own show, because it's not actually about Ratliff. There's no witnesses about Ratliff, really. I mean, they try to bring it in for effect about how much her friends cried and it was so sad she was gone. But it's not like the police investigators and the coroner at that time were called in. And this is just so, I can't even begin to believe that this was allowed to happen in this trial.
It's insane. And look, I mean, you can understand all the problems with this. They can't even decide how much blood there was. Was there a lot of blood? Was there not a lot of blood? At the time, very quickly, both the American and the German police determined that this was a natural death. You literally had a doctor who did a spinal tap at the sign of the death, looked at the fluid, concluded it was bloody, which is a sure sign of an aneurysm. And then 16 years later, 18 years later, whatever it was, you've got the Durham police who, once again, they were all about winning, and they wanted to win at any cost. So instead of just having an independent, and I know they would say, well, our people are independent too. They only care about justice. Like, whatever. Like, forget you. Like, instead of having an independent person in Texas exhume that body, take a look at it, and then rebury it, which is what should have happened. I mean, this is a human being. They bring it all the way back to North Carolina so their ringer can say the same thing about this body that she said about, Kathleen Peterson, and just some of it is just so ridiculous. The fact, if you even look, they have the diagrams of what Kathleen Peterson's head looked like and what Elizabeth Ratliff's head looked like, and the fact that they even try and say there's a comparison is utterly insane. They do the whole, there were 7 lacerations on both heads, which is an awfully weird way to kill people. You're going to beat somebody to death with specifically 7 strikes in both cases, right? And in one of them, you have these huge lacerations on the top of the head. And then on the other one, you have these very small lacerations that are more so on the crown or on the forehead and on the back of the head. And this is actually interesting because one of the reasons to think that Kathleen Peterson was murdered is those wounds are so high on her head. And there's a general rule of thumb when you're looking at beatings. It's called like the brim of the cap rule or something like that. And basically, if the wound is above the brim of the cap and the further above, the better, it is more likely a beating because people don't tend to fall on the top of their head. If it is below that, then it's more consistent with an accident. And I think even if you just look at the diagrams of where these wounds were, it really looks like Ratliff was at the top of the stairs, had the aneurysm, fell down the stairs, in the process of doing so, hit her head a couple times, and that's what caused these wounds, not some, yet another beating by Michael Peterson. That, by the way, somehow he leaves her house pretty late at night, but she would have been dead for hours and hours and hours. We hear so much about how, well, Kathleen Peterson must have been murdered because a couple hours had passed and her blood was dry and all this other stuff. And yet, when they find Ratliff, the things we know for sure is the blood wasn't dry and her body was still warm and she wasn't in rigor mortis, which makes you think that she didn't die at 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock at night the night before. Having said all that, look, maybe Michael Peterson did kill Elizabeth Ratliff, but that should have been decided in a court of law. Heck, you want to decide it in a court of law now? Fine. Go ahead and bring that charge and see if you can get that indictment and put it in front of a jury. But what you shouldn't do is try a murder case in another murder case to try and use that as evidence that he killed Kathleen Peterson. I think that's incredibly improper, and I think Hudson reached the right decision the second time around. So, I mean, I can't think of anything else we haven't talked about. Alice, is there anything even left? Should we just go ahead and sign off?
Well, that'd be pretty wild if you left something out.
I know. Wait. What's that? Oh no.
can't play it cool. What really happened?
Look out. And that brings us to the owl theory.
It's not called the owl theory. It's called what really happened.
Exactly. That brings us to the resolution of this case. And I know some of you have probably been like, why do they keep making these weird puns about who over and over again? It's because one of the most popular theories in this case is that Kathleen Peterson, she didn't fall down the stairs, and it wasn't an accident. She was murdered, but not by Michael Peterson, but by an owl.
Sorry, real quick. For those of you who can't understand Brett's accent, he said owl, like the animal that says who.
What's that?
I love your accent, Brett.
Owl.
I'm sorry. I just had to poke fun a little bit because you're America's sweetheart.
So there's tons of articles about this, but I chose to use the one from vulture.com because I thought that was the most appropriate place to find one about the owl theory. But essentially, this originated with a lawyer named Larry Pollard, who happened to be one of the Petersons' next door neighbors. And he actually didn't come up with this theory until the trial was basically over. The version, it essentially goes like this. So Kathleen, they go out to the pool. Michael's smoking his cigar. Kathleen's got to go back up. Well, as she's heading back to the house, she does something that annoys an owl that's living in the woods nearby. And this owl, essentially right as she's arriving at the house, swoops down silently and strikes her in the head. And when it does this, it takes its talons and it digs those talons deep into her scalp. So you can imagine she's going inside. She's trying to get rid of the bird. There's a little bit of blood left outside because there was like a couple drops of blood outside, not enough to really figure out what was going on there unless she was attacked by an owl. But she's struggling with this owl, and she had been drinking. Her blood alcohol level was 0.07, basically intoxicated. She certainly shouldn't be driving. And, she was taking some other drugs, some anti-anxiety medication and possibly some muscle relaxers. And when you combine all that together, she's tired and she's been drinking, and now she's terrified and she's trying to get away from this owl, and she's heading up the stairs. And at some point she slips, she falls backwards. Maybe she hits her head again. She blacks out and she bleeds to death. It's possible that at some point she gets back up and slips again and falls. And in whatever happens, the owl is now flown away. The owl's escaped back into the woods. And at some point, Michael Peterson comes up and discovers what's happened. Now, this may seem absolutely insane to you, and I would totally understand that. First time I heard it, I thought it was crazy too. But there is evidence for it. For one, and this is going to blow your mind. Microscopic owl feathers were found. You remember Alice talking about how she had her own hair in her hands, and why would that happen? You know what was in that hair? Microscopic owl feathers. And so you can just imagine the owl is in her hair and she's trying to get that owl away, and it's hurting, and he's like clawing her and all this other stuff. And she actually does pull her own hair out, trying to dislodge this owl.
Wait, here's a quick question on the microscopic owl feathers. If you're being attacked viciously by an owl, wouldn't there be more than just microscopic owl feathers? Wouldn't there be some bigger feathers?
So I don't know how owl feathers work. I mean, they are predators, so assumably they're striking things all the time. So maybe their feathers are made in such a way that they don't dislodge that easily. That is always something I wondered as well. Would there be yet more evidence of the owl if it was an owl? So I don't know that, but what I do know is that microscopic owl feathers grow on the owl's talons. So,
Boom.
It may not look like they have feathers, but that's where that very type of feather is found, is on those talons.
And here's the question. How the heck, let's say it wasn't an owl, how the heck did talon owl feathers land in her hair?
Your guess is as good as mine. I don't think they put owl talon feathers in pillows these days.
Well, I mean, I feel like the trying to prove the or trying to explain that piece of evidence without an owl is actually even harder than believing that maybe an owl had something to do with it.
And it doesn't stop there.
Oh, dear.
Because if you look at the wounds, and we're like, how could you make those wounds? And the prosecution is like making up blowpokes, and the defense has Kathleen fallen down like 4 different times to make those perfectly trident patterned wounds. Well,
Trident, like
what
talons.
does an owl's talons look like? That's right, a trident. And you have this pattern. It's perfect. I mean, if you took an owl's talons and you put it on the wound, that's what you have. You have that same pattern. And it's not that unusual to have these kind of owls attack people in that neighborhood. When NBC's Dateline covered this, they actually found a local man who was attacked by an owl. It was caught on surveillance cameras. He said it was like being hit in the head with a baseball bat, and he bled so much that he thought he'd lost an eye. So David Rudolph in his website. So basically, the guy brings this to David Rudolph, and he says, we're like closing tomorrow. It's probably a bad time to bring up the owl theory. And I think he was right about that. He had the fake blowpoke, or the blowpoke that wasn't the murder weapon. So he probably was pretty good about that. But now he's kind of come around to this whole owl theory thing. And so on his website, he actually lays out the points in favor of the owl theory. So I'm just going to go ahead and read those to you. But Alice, if you wanted to interject, you can.
I was going to say, I don't know if this theory was brought to Rudolph really the night before closing. That's what he said in the documentary. If it was the night before closing, you can't bring it up because you haven't introduced the evidence of the microscopic, feathers and the talons and the trident and whatnot. So you can't bring it up in closing. But if he had time to put this defense on, as crazy as this story sounds, I think I would have put this theory out there because remember what we said, I think now in episode 1 or 2, how the best story still wins, that the jury still wants a story. They don't want to just have a question mark as to what happened to Kathleen. They want to understand what happened. And the fall theory just isn't very convincing. It's hard to imagine the fall causing those lacerations. So if I were him, as crazy as it might sound, I think I would try to put the story on.
It'd be interesting to see what would happen.
It would be crazy.
So here's the things he lays out that would be his evidence. So the type of owl we're talking about is a barred owl, and barred owls were living in the woods by the Peterson home. They are known to be aggressive and dangerous, and there's actually an Audubon.org article about how these are vicious owls, and they actually, the point of the article was the barred owl responsible for the murder of Kathleen Peterson. They have attacked people on numerous occasions. This is not something that happens once in a blue moon. There were drops of blood on the outside walkway leading to the front door of the house, which we see on the police photos. There was a large smear of blood on the outside of the front door frame, as shown in police photos, and it's very difficult to figure out where that would come from. It doesn't really make sense for Michael Peterson, after killing Kathleen Peterson, and I guess, wandering outside to contemplate what he's done, to then smear blood on the side of the door. It makes more sense that Kathleen Peterson, a victim, might do something like that. At least 2 of the wounds, this is another interesting thing, at least 2 of the wounds on Kathleen Peterson's scalp are in the shape, well, actually, this is not the interesting thing, I'll get to that in a second, but are in the shape of the talons of a barred owl, and we talked about that, and we'll put the image, the drawing of her wounds on the website, and you can take a look at it and decide for yourself. This is interesting because Kathleen had tiny wounds on her face, and it was unclear where these would have come from because they don't look like wounds you'd make with a blowpoke, for instance, and it's unclear how you would make these tiny wounds. However, they are consistent with the tip of an owl's beak, so you can imagine the owl, whatever, like
Pecking.
beaking her. Pecking. There you go. That's the word.
Pecking.
Pecking her. In addition to the feather that we've already talked about, a twig was found in the dried blood on her body. Where'd the twig come from? We talked about this. There are numerous strands of Kathleen Peterson's head hair, and the roots indicate they were actually pulled out by the root, and there are microscopic owl feathers in the hair, and these are the kinds of feathers that grow on an owl's feet and claws. And we've said this 1,000 times, Kathleen's head injuries are not consistent with her having been beaten by a blunt object or beaten on the stairs, or frankly, even falling down the stairs. She had no brain injury or swelling, no subdural hematoma, and no skull fracture. And this is something I noticed rewatching The Staircase. But when you watch the first episode of The Staircase, at the very end, they are testing whether or not you can hear someone crying and screaming from the stairs, and they're all out on the pool trying to hear, and it's completely silent except for the sound of an owl hooting.
Are you kidding?
I am not kidding.
Did they add that in?
I don't think so.
That's crazy. I did not notice that.
Yeah, go back and watch it. Go back and watch that very last part. Yeah, now you have to.
But you remember what I said in an earlier episode, that it's almost like you had to slice, like with a knife or something, to get those lacerations without the head trauma? Talons are like knives.
Exactly. It's like nature's Freddy Krueger right there, flying through the skies. You never knew it. You know, my dog hates birds. He barks at owls like crazy. And I always tell my wife, he knows. He knows. Like today, he was barking at a bird inside. And she was like, why are you barking at that bird? We're inside. And I said, owl theory. And there you go. So he knows what he's doing.
Okay. But I mean, I think that sounds real. I will say the first time I ever heard owl theory, I started laughing. I was like, okay, aliens, whatever. That's just another twist on it. But, I mean, those are actually pretty compelling. And what gets me is, how do you explain the microscopic owl feathers just in general? Like, owls are predators, and you typically don't let them like flutter around your head, without batting them away or something. But in complete seriousness, what do we think happened here? I can say with a lot of certainty that I do not think there should have been a conviction beyond reasonable doubt. I think there was absolutely reasonable doubt, and that in the first trial, Michael Peterson should not have been found guilty. Now, what ultimately happened, I don't know for a fact. I don't think that she was beaten, and I don't think she fell. That leaves me with like a lot of question marks, and maybe it's the owl theory, but I don't think it's either the prosecution's theory or the defense's theory.
Yeah, at the end of the day, we know it wasn't an intruder. Or at least there's no evidence of it being an intruder. I guess it could have been, but you've kind of faced the same problem.
Same problems with no DNA, no evidence of someone else. You would still probably see some shred of DNA of someone else, and there's none of that.
And I just got to say, I mean, just running through it, right? I mean, we could talk about this for 4 more episodes if we wanted to, but just look at some of the stuff. At the end of the day, the prosecution's case was speculative. You had the first medical examiner shows up and says it's consistent with a fall. No, wait, says Deborah Radish. She was murdered. Oh, and by the way, the cause of death is blunt force trauma, even though there's no actual trauma, no fractures, which is about as common in a blunt force trauma case as owls murdering people. He did it with a blowpoke. Oh, wait, there's the blowpoke. It wasn't what killed her. Turns out we're wrong. Well, maybe he did it for money, but he's got this movie deal. Okay, so he did it when she found out about his gay relationships. But here's a question. What's the evidence she even knew about those? We've talked about this, and we've speculated that maybe she saw the photo. There's no computer forensics saying that photo or a photo or an email was opened at, 12 midnight that day. There's nothing other than pure speculation that can lead you to believe that that theory is correct. So at the end of the day, I don't know how you can find Michael Peterson guilty based on the evidence you have, because the best evidence you have, and the evidence that wasn't speculation, and the evidence that was science, and that you were supposed to build this case on, was the blood spatter evidence. And you cannot remove Dwayne Deaver from that evidence. And maybe the first time around, when Dwayne Deaver had, and been involved in 500 cases and written 200 reports and been to 30 different scenes of falls, well, maybe you could convict him then, because you had a rock solid expert telling you that in his professional expert opinion, this was murder. But he was a liar, and he was proven to be a liar, and he was fired, and Michael Peterson's conviction was overturned because of it. And I will always believe that if Michael Peterson had gone to trial again, he would have been acquitted. And I don't even know if the prosecution could have made it. At the end of the prosecution's case, in every single case, the defense moves for a judgment of acquittal because the prosecution hasn't even put on enough evidence to go to the jury. And I don't know if the prosecution could have got past that if they had gone to trial the second time. So I agree with Alice. There's no way that Michael Peterson was proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And I will say this, and this will be controversial for a lot of people, but I think the theory that we have that matches the evidence the best is the owl theory. As crazy as that sounds, and I'm not saying the owl did it, but it is the theory that, for me, explains so many of the bizarre inconsistencies in this case.
I will say, when we started out at the very beginning, not even before we even recorded the first episode, I was like actively anti-owl theory. And by now, I think I'm team owl. Because of what you said, with the evidence we do have that isn't messed up by Dwayne Deavers, it looks like owl to me.
And I know people are throwing their phones across the room right now. And I know there were people who were just so excited for us to say exactly why Michael Peterson did it. And maybe he did. I'm not saying he didn't.
We're saying we don't have the evidence to back it up.
I think it is probably more likely that he murdered her than that she just fell down the stairs. I think that is probably true.
I agree with that.
Not beyond a reasonable doubt, more likely, but more likely, you put a gun to my head. Did she fall down the stairs or did he murder her? I don't know how he did it. If he did do it, I hope on his deathbed he tells us how.
Maybe he sicked an owl on her.
Maybe he did. Maybe he did. Or he went after her with a razor blade or something. But it's a crazy case, and like I said, I know the owl thing is crazy, but I think this goes back to our rules. This case is so extraordinary in so many ways. It's just not a typical case. And as weird as that would be for that to be the answer, like I said, you look at all the inconsistencies, you look at this bizarre manner of death, and it makes sense to me. It makes more sense than him beating her with another blunt object that is hollow and doesn't crack the skull, or her falling down the stairs without managing to break any bones. I mean, there's just nothing really consistent to me with, like Alice said, with either the prosecution or the defense's theory.
I think we're going to get a lot of emails about this one. Keep it coming. We love it.
Yeah. Yeah, and look, I mean, I know a lot of you, maybe most of you, are not going to agree with us on this, and that's fine. This is why we enjoy it. If we all knew what had happened and we all agreed on what happened, this would be boring, right? So we don't want to do that. And look, normally we're the Debbie Downers on this podcast. Normally we're like, all your crazy theories are stupid, and it obviously was the most mundane thing possible. Not this time. So hopefully you guys enjoyed that. Hopefully, even if you disagree with our final conclusion, this has been enlightening in some ways. If we got anything wrong, if we missed anything, we said a lot of things, we made a lot of blanket statements, so I'm sure we've messed some things up. Please let us know. You guys know how to get in touch with us at ProsecutorsPod for Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. ProsecutorsPod@gmail.com. And prosecutorspodcast.com is our website. And if you reach out to us, we will try and reach out to you. I think we've been pretty good about doing that. I hope you guys will keep those great reviews coming. Like I said, they're what keep us going. You know, when Alice has had like an 18-hour a day and I'm forcing her to record anyway, it's those 5-star reviews that keep her coming back to work. So.
No, you guys are the best. These are nicer words than my own mom tells me. I love my mom. But these are such nice words. Thank you guys for listening.
And, you know, Alice, I think you should take us home tonight.
All right. Thank you guys for joining us on this amazing 4-part saga. We loved going through it with you. And until next time, I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And we are the prosecutors.
What's funny is the people who've never heard the owl theory, they're going to be like, what are y'all doing? Why do you keep doing that?
If people haven't caught on by now, they're probably like, what the heck is wrong with you? Why is he so weird?
Oh, God. Anyways, okay. I got to focus on my name.
Okay, focus.
Here.
Your name is Beretta.
It's Barrett.
Barrett.
Barrett. I can't do
Brett,
that.
Brett.
Okay. Get serious. Get serious, Alice. Okay.
I'm always serious.